Welcome back, and thank you for joining me for another episode with my worms. As always, I do updates weekly on my totes, starting with the regular totes. And with my regular totes, I don't have any holes at the bottom. The lids do have a screen vent at the top. And with the regular totes, I typically do have issues with the tote holding a lot of moisture. Last summer, the tote spent the whole time with a screen, like a mosquito screen or a screen door screen over the top, or cheesecloth to try to allow the water to evaporate. And this has recently been restarted. So my focus on this bin is on trying to keep the wetness down in these bins. I don't want them to be dry. I don't want them to be muddy though. So as I'm checking the bin contents, I do notice that it is damper than it was before. And here's a good worm ball. I did pocket feeding the last week, so the worms are concentrated towards the end. But I expect in the area where the worms are concentrated, where I fed, to always be wetter. So I account for that area being a bit mushy. But in the rest of the bin, I do want it to be a bit drier. And I'm noticing now, after a few weeks, that the area is not as dry as I would want it to be. Despite that, the health of the bin looks really well. The worms look happy. But the concern I have is this right here. These are not pot worms. These are actually larvae from whether fruit fly or something I put into the bin. So I'm going to take out these large piece items from my bin and put in chopped up items in the bin. I'm going to take these larger pieces out and try to use less fresh veggies and fruit in the bin and more things that have already been frozen. So these particular squash pieces and pumpkin pieces I'm putting in have already been frozen. I noticed that that does help to cut down with any additional pests bringing in because it's not a fresh item. Once I've fed this bin, I am not wetting this bin down. I'm not adding additional cardboard. I'm just going to close it up. Moving over to the second regular tote. Now with this one, I pocket fed a larger area. I pocket fed towards the bottom half, and that's why it looks wetter than the top half. So I'm going to first start in the area where the feeding wasn't, just to kind of see. And as I go through this material, this one is wetter towards the top, still kind of damp towards the bottom, but wet towards the top. And when I start moving the material over here, that's where I start finding my worms and some food. And again, the worms are looking really good. They seem to have gotten a little bit bigger in this bin, but there is quite a bit of food since it was a fresher food. It wasn't frozen items the last time, so I'm noticing a lot of larger chunks of food in here. And again, I think that might have contributed to finding the larvae for the worm or for the fruit flies or flies in there. So I'm going to mix everything all together just to try to get the drier material from the top mixed in with the wetter material from the bottom. And then I'm going to feed this, skip the bubble wrap and skip wetting this bin as it doesn't need any additional moisture. I'm also going to do something a little different in this bins, and I'm going to blend up any of the fresh items. That way it's smaller pieces that the worms can break down faster. Sometimes I just chop it up into large chunks, but with the issue with the larva that I saw in there, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to blend it. Moving over to the first of my two Vermibag totes. Pulling the top off of this one, I noticed that there is a lot larger area where the material looks dry just from first glance. And as I mix it up, the top layer was pretty dry and crunchy, but underneath there was a larger area of damp material. So with this bin, just like the other ones, I do want to mix it up really well so that I'm able to mix all the contents together. Again, another good worm ball here, nice size worms. So the size of the worms seem to be getting bigger in all the bins since the harvest. So I'm just going to dig all the way down, and the bag is deeper than you would think, but I'm going to dig all the way down and get that damper and more moist material up towards the bottom and push that drier material down, as it seems like the moisture does go downward. Looking at this material, feeling this material, it is quite a few weeks ahead of the other bins. So I noticed that the material itself is a bit more processed than the other bins. And I'm going to add also to this one the chopped up material just to see how that affects the worms and the moisture content as well. But for this bin, I am going to add additional water to this bin and cover it with the bubble wrap, but I am not going to add any additional cardboard to raise the content level. I do want it to be a bit more processed before I add any more. Moving over to the second Vermibag tote. And with this one, I didn't have the bubble wrap all over because I noticed that this bin was a bit wetter than the previous one. And the sides of this bin are also pretty dry, so I am mixing this up really well. And the biggest thing about the Vermibag totes is that you really want to get to the bottom, because the material at the bottom is definitely going to be a lot wetter and a different consistency than the material at the top. So if you're someone that does fluff your worm bin, make sure you do get to the very bottom level. And since I did pocket feed this batch, there are a ton of worms that are in the area where the food was. Nice good worm ball there. And again, the worms themselves look really good. Unlike the other bin, I didn't see any other evidence of fly larvae in my bins, but I am still going to be more cautious and continue to feed the smaller blended food than feeding the larger chunks this time, since I am still dealing with the same sweet potato and squash. Moving on to the last bin, which is the Vermibag Mini, and it is the only flow-through system that I have. With this one, the previous week I felt that the material was a bit too dry, so I only used the bubble wrap in one area, and in the area where the bubble wrap is, you can see that the worms are concentrated there. I feed the whole top. I don't pocket feed in this one. I just feed a top layer onto the Vermibag Mini, so the worms are always pretty dispersed, but in this case they stayed towards the area that had the most moisture. To give you an idea of how many worms are towards the top, here's a chunk of worms. This is not mostly cardboard, it is actually mostly worms. It was squirming in my hand, but the worms are still staying towards the top, which is where I want them to be. So for this bin, it is going to get the cut up pieces because I am concerned with the previous feedings with any larvae being in there, and it's going to get the grit added to it. I'm not going to add any additional cardboard, but I will be wetting it down, and then that will complete the update for all the bins. As always, thanks for watching, but you can always stick around and watch another video as well too.